You're listening to ABC RN's Health Report. I'm Norman Swan. The United States and other countries have been reporting a very scary fungal outbreak in hospitals. It's called Candida auris. It's hard to diagnose, is resistant to all known medications and some routine antiseptics, and is travelling around the world. Australia seems to have escaped with only a couple of cases. It's just one example of potentially dangerous microorganisms which can land in our airports or even spread through the food supply, causing food poisoning and even deaths. Controlling such infections, including antibiotic-resistant bacteria, requires them to be tracked. But that can be hard to do because they can be hidden in a population of other germs that look superficially the same. One solution is sequencing the genetic fingerprint of these bugs, which is why a group of researchers has called for a microbial genomics capacity to be built in Australia. One of these researchers is Associate Professor Deborah Williamson of the Doherty Institute in Melbourne. Thanks for joining us on the Health Report.
Good evening, Norman. Thanks for having me.
So you've heard me define the problem. Is that how you define the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Norman. I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
So why can't we do this now? It's not as if we're new to genomics. There's lots of genomics facilities in Australia. There's lots of good microbiologists. Why aren't we doing it now?
Well, actually we are doing it now. Around the different states have this capacity. But what we're not doing at the moment is joining the dots up, so joining this up nationally. And I guess what we are talking about in this article is really improved national coordination and resource for this technology to make sure that it's not just confined to 2 or 3 different states, it's really equitable across the country. And we really believe that that's in the national interest and that it would significantly improve Australia's capacity to detect and to respond to infectious diseases.
So what's the burden of the problem? Or what's the dimension of the problem in Australia? In terms of number of people affected, number of people dying. After all, we are broadcasting. We might as well be sensationalist about it.
That's a curveball, Norman. Well, look, it depends. I guess
it's a career-ending question, really.
Thank you for that. Yep. I guess it depends on what pathogen, what infections you're talking about.
So, to be serious, give me an example of a problem that they've got in Australia that's not being solved because bugs don't respect state borders.
Okay, well, the question of antimicrobial resistance would be, an exemplar of that. So at the moment, there's no, formal capacity to link the genetic sequences of antimicrobial resistant bugs in one state with another, or indeed internationally. And I guess the technology that we're talking about, whole genome sequencing, which is where you look at the entire genetic sequence of an organism, the technology is a kind of unifying technology in so much as we can compare sequences very rapidly across state and territory borders and across international borders. And that, if you think about the way that bacteria evolve and have emerged and become resistant, they're really smart. They've got billions of years of evolution on their side. And we really need to pull out everything that we can to combat that and be much more sophisticated in our approach to preventing and controlling these outbreaks. So antimicrobial resistance would be an exemplar of that. Food
poisoning organisms being another. So what is it, because we lack genome sequencing facilities, or are there legal barriers? What's the story here in terms of stopping us cooperating as a state? I mean, are we talking about the railway gauge again, or what?
Partly, yes. So there are a number of barriers, I guess, to this. Some are real, some are perceived, but I should say that none of them are insurmountable. So I guess some of the real barriers, one of the ones that you've mentioned, is that some states and territories simply do not have the hardware or the workforce capacity to do that. And that's what we would like to change. There are some barriers around sharing of data.
They can always put a swab in the mail and send by courier and send it to Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane, couldn't they?
Well, that's not the model that we would like. We would like to build capacity across the country. And the reason is that, it'd be great for different states and territories to be able to use this for their own local purposes in real time. So sending isolates across the country takes time. It can take days, sometimes it can take weeks, but this information can be generated very quickly and used very quickly. So that's some of I guess some of the real barriers. Some of the perceived barriers are around some threats to privacy, for example, from industry, and indeed actually from the research community itself around sharing data.
You're kidding? When people's lives are at stake?
Actually, interestingly, the WHO have just put out a code of conduct for open and timely sharing of genetic sequence data from pathogens during outbreaks. So there's a recognition now that if you're involved in an outbreak, and it's good practice, it's simply the right thing to do to share data very quickly with public health agencies, not just in your own country but around the world.
Now, the UK and the US are doing this.
They are doing it, yes. They've been doing it for a number of years now, and it's led to some. It hasn't. I don't think it's been entirely straightforward for them, but it has led to certainly some reductions in outbreaks in the US, and that they've published on this. So
how does it lead to controlling outbreaks faster?
Okay, well, if we go back to the foodborne disease example, so if you're able to link a company and an outbreak earlier, what that can mean is that a contaminated facility, for example, can be closed quicker. It can lead to more specificity in food safety recalls, which ultimately, I guess, prevents food wastage.
Traditionally, farmers have resisted this because they say it could be traced. They don't want it to be traced back to the original farm, for example, in food poisoning.
Look, I think that's an important point, but it is something that is actively being worked through, not just in Australia, but internationally.
Consumers would
as
like
well.
to know which farm it came from.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you think about
is the farming community part of the resistance here?
I couldn't comment specifically on the farming community, but I think certainly from the food industry as a whole, efforts are being made to work through this process with a number of industries as well. But if you think about some of the benefits that could actually, I guess, befall the industries rather than some of the negative aspects. So they could rapidly say that they were not part of an outbreak, for example. And certainly some pathogens, they could say that, look at different virulence characteristics in pathogens and know that, for example, if something was contaminated, it may not be particularly virulent.
So just finally, in whose court is it to actually do something about this? Because I think most people listening to this would be fairly shocked.
As I say, what we are advocating for is sustainable national resourcing and coordination for this and equity across jurisdictions. There are a number of ways that could happen. One of them is through, I guess, some translational research funding, but that's not, a particularly sustainable model. And I guess the impetus for this to happen has to come centrally.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Associate Professor Deborah Williamson is at the Doherty Institute at the University of Melbourne.